Where do people stand on the concept of net zero when it's just offered to them with no context?
Well, if you give people just a straightforward question, do you support the push for net zero, then you'll often find that a large majority of voters will say, yes, absolutely. And if you ask them, do you support the fight against climate change, more often than not, voters will say, yes, absolutely. But the key point here is when you then actually explain to voters what these policies mean for them personally in terms of the financial costs, they become much less supportive of these policies.
And how sensitive are they to cost? And has there been any change in this? Has the cost of living crisis made people more concerned about costs than they may have been a couple of years ago?
I think partly we're seeing the effects of the cost of living crisis. I think also, in my view, voters are beginning to tune into what net zero means for them. I think the ULEZ issue in London and Greater London has been very important for that reason. The fact that voters are now beginning to think about, well, hang on a minute, this is actually imposing some very real financial penalties on on motorists. And so as voters begin to look at the detail of the policy, what we're finding is more voters oppose some of these policies than support, and that's especially true among Conservatives.
So how does this divide up in terms of the ULEZ support and opposition amongst different categories of voters? You've got a very helpful chart, I think.
Yeah, sure. So if you look at all voters in the country, only 32% say they support ULEZ, about 42% say they oppose, the rest are undecided. If you then ask voters, well, would you like a ULEZ in your local area, they become much more strongly opposed. So typically about two-thirds of voters will say, I don't really want to have a ULEZ in my local area. If you then drill down into the voters that are going to be key for Rishi Sunak, those 2019 Conservatives, the people who voted for Boris Johnson, who voted for this big challenge to the status quo, well, they're absolutely convinced that they don't support ULEZ, they don't want a ULEZ in their local area, and they really want the government to zoom in on prioritising the cost of living crisis, even if that undermines some of these net zero goals. So what I'm pointing to here, Jacob, is widespread opposition to these policies.